Dr. Raymond Thompson slammed the patient chart down so hard it skidded off the edge of the counter and hit the floor. He didn't look at it, he looked at her. "Who authorized this IV line change?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the ward like a blade. Sarah Bennett stood at the bedside, his steady eyes calm. The patient's pressure was dropping. "I made a call." Thompson stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You made a call," he repeated, each word dripping with contempt. "You're a nurse, a rookie nurse. You don't make calls in my hospital. You follow orders." "Are we clear?" The soldiers in the ward went quiet. Nobody moved, nobody said a word, and Sarah, she just looked at him and said, "Yes, sir," but her hands never shook. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are exactly where you need to be. Please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens inside this hospital will leave you breathless. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The forward operating base sat on the edge of nothing. That was how the soldiers described it, the edge of nothing. A stretch of hard earth and dry wind in eastern Afghanistan, where the mountains watched everything and gave nothing back. The field hospital was built into a converted warehouse, its walls reinforced with sandbags, its hallways lit by overhead fluorescents that buzzed and flickered when the generator strained. It smelled like antiseptic and iron, and underneath that, something heavier that no one talked about. The smell of men who had come too close to dying. Sarah Bennett had been there for 11 weeks. She kept count, not because she was homesick, she had learned a long time ago not to hold on to places, but because counting was a habit. Counting days, counting steps, counting exits. 3 doors in the main ward, 2 in the trauma bay. 1 loading entrance that the staff used to move patients in from the field. She knew all of it. She knew it the way a person knows their own heartbeat, not by thinking, but by feel. She was 28 years old and she looked like exactly what her badge said she was. A nurse. Medium height, dark hair, pulled back scrubs that were always a half size too big because she preferred room to move. She didn't draw attention to herself. She didn't try to. When the other nurses gathered in the break room to trade complaints about the hours, or the heat, or Dr. Thompson's moods, Sarah poured her coffee, listened more than she spoke, and left before the conversation turned to questions about her background. She had answers ready. She always had answers ready. She'd gone to nursing school in Virginia. She'd worked 2 years at a regional hospital outside of Richmond before volunteering for the deployment. Yes, she was still getting used to the pace out here. Yes, it was different from back home. Yes, she appreciated the tips. Every word was true. None of it was complete. Sergeant Marcus Hayes noticed her on her 3rd day. He was recovering in bed 5, his left leg elevated after a shrapnel wound that had torn through his calf during a perimeter breach. The wound was clean, the surgeons had done good work, but the recovery was slow and Marcus hated slow. He hated the bed, hated the IV line, hated the way the other guys in the ward tried not to look at him like he was fragile. So he watched the staff instead. It was something to do. He watched Dr. Thompson make his rounds like a man who expected applause at every stop. He watched the other nurses hustle through their checklists, efficient, but harried, running on too little sleep and too much duty. And then he watched Sarah Bennett. She moved differently. That was the first thing. Most people in a field hospital move with urgency, quick steps, eyes forward, always somewhere to be. Sarah moved with something slower and more deliberate underneath the efficiency, like she was calculating each step before she took it, like she was doing 2 things at once, her job and something else entirely. "Hey," Marcus said one morning when she was changing his wound dressing. She didn't look up. "Good morning, Sergeant. How long have you been a nurse?" She unwrapped the bandage with practiced hands. "Few years." "Where'd you train?" "Virginia." A pause. She pressed gently around the wound, checking the tissue. "This is healing clean. You've been keeping off it like you're supposed to." "I don't have much choice." He watched her work. "You always this quiet." "I talk when I have something to say." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He let her finish the dressing before he spoke again. "I've been in 3 combat deployments, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Kandahar. I've worked with a lot of medical staff out here." "Okay," she said. You move like somebody who's been downrange before. Sarah picked up the used dressing, set it in the biohazard bin, and pulled off her gloves. She looked at him, then steady and direct. I move like somebody who's good at her job, Sergeant. She picked up her chart. Your next dressing change is at 1400. Try to eat something before then. She walked away without rushing. Marcus watched her go, and the feeling that had started on day 3 settled a little deeper into his chest. He didn't know what it was yet. He just knew that Sarah Bennett was not exactly what she appeared to be. The morning the convoy came in, the radio had been crackling for 2 hours before the vehicles arrived. Fragments of transmissions coordinates casualty counts. Sarah was in the middle of a medication reconciliation at the nurse's station when the first reports came through and she went still, the way an animal goes still, not with fear, but with focus. She listened to the numbers being called over the comm. 7 wounded, 4 critical. Mechanism of injury IED blast followed by small arms ambush. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. She set down her clipboard. Trauma bay, she said to the nurse beside her, a young woman named Deb, who had been deployed for 6 weeks and still flinched at the radio bursts. Get trauma bay ready for 4 criticals. We need 2 large-bore IVs prepped on every station O-negative in the cooler, and someone needs to call respiratory before they get here, not after. Deb blinked. Doctor, Thompson hasn't come in yet. Respiratory, Sarah said again, calm and absolute. Go. Deb went. Sarah moved to the supply cabinet, pulled out what she needed, and began setting up her own station with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this not in a training scenario, but in actual darkness, under actual fire, with actual lives riding on the next 30 seconds. She didn't think about it. Her hands simply knew. Thompson arrived 4 minutes later, coat half on, coffee in hand. He took one look at the trauma bay, already prepped, already staged supplies, laid out in precise order, and then looked at Sarah. Did you do this? He demanded. Casualties in 8 minutes, she said. 4 critical. He looked around again as if checking her work against some internal standard. Then he grunted and set down his coffee. Where's my team? I called them. They're coming. He looked at her a beat too long. You called my team. Someone had to. His jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, she could see it, that reflex he had to reassert the hierarchy whenever it felt challenged. But the radio burst again with updated casualty information, and the moment passed. He put on his coat and took his place at the head of the bay, and Sarah stepped back to her position, and the team poured in round them. The vehicles arrived with a sound that hit before they were visible, a low, hard rumble of engines pushed past their limits, and then the loading doors burst open and the medics were already moving, shouting handoff reports as they wheeled the litters in. First patient, Corporal James Reyes, 22 years old, blast injury to the lower extremities, BP 70 over palp, heart rate 142. Large bore IVs en route, lost about 800 cubic centimeters in the field. Bring him to Bay 1, Thompson called. Second patient specialist Dana Cho, penetrating chest wound, left side decreased. Breath sounds, we did a needle decompression in the field. She's Bay 2 now. Third patient is. The bay became a controlled storm, bodies moving, voices, overlapping monitors, shrieking the wet sounds of trauma care that never made it into the movies. Sarah was at Bay 2 beside Specialist Cho, who was conscious and terrified, her eyes darting around the ceiling of the trauma bay like she couldn't fix them anywhere. Dana, Sarah said, and something in her voice made the young woman look at her. Look at me, right here. She snapped on gloves. What's your unit? 3rd Battalion. 3rd Battalion, good. You're in the hospital now? We have you. She was already assessing the chest, fingers moving, reading the injury by touch. Does this hurt? She pressed. Yes, yeah. Good, that means your nerves are working. She looked up at the respiratory tech. She reaccumulated. I need a chest tube tray. The tech hesitated, looking across the bay toward Thompson. Chest tube tray, Sarah said again, her voice dropping half a register, not louder but somehow more final. The tech moved. Thompson heard it from across the room. He looked over, watched Sarah's hands moving over the patient, watched the tech responding to her without question, and his own eyes narrowed. Bennett, he called. Busy doctor. His jaw tightened again. He turned back to his own patient. Sarah worked without looking up. She talked to Dana Cho the entire time, Not empty reassurance, but real conversation. Questions that kept the young woman's mind engaged and her breathing measured, interspersed with precise clinical commands to the staff around her. By the time the chest tube was in and Cho's oxygen saturation was climbing back toward normal, the worst of the initial rush had passed. The bay was quieter. The most critical patients were stabilized. The monitors beeped steadily instead of screaming. Sarah stripped off her gloves and moved to the hand sanitizer station. "You placed that chest tube," Thompson said from behind her. It wasn't a question. She turned to face him. She was decompensating. "I'm the attending physician. I decide." She would have coded in 40 seconds. Sarah kept her voice even. "I made the call I had to make. If that's a problem, we can discuss it when she's not in the ICU." The other staff in the bay had gone very still. Nurses, techs, even the respiratory therapist, everyone suddenly found something to look at that wasn't Thompson's face. Thompson stepped closer. Not threateningly, but deliberately, the way men do when they want to remind you how tall they are. "You are a staff nurse, Bennett, not a physician, not a surgeon. You are here to support the medical team, not to run it." His voice was low and deliberate. "Do you understand the difference?" "I understand it perfectly," she said. "Do you want to discuss it now or after rounds?" Someone in the back of the bay. One of the younger nurses, barely suppressing something, made a sound that died immediately. Thompson stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the bay, his coat snapping behind him. Marcus Hayes, who had been moved to the observation area during the influx of casualties and had watched all of it from a wheelchair near the door, let out a slow breath. He looked at the nurse beside him, a veteran woman named Caldwell, who had been at the base for 8 months. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. Caldwell watched Sarah move to the next patient, already on to the next thing, expression calm. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 11 weeks, she said. Sarah caught her break at 1700, which meant she sat in the hallway outside the supply room with a plastic cup of terrible coffee and 11 minutes to be still. She drank it in 4 sips and spent the rest of the time looking at the wall and not thinking about anything. That was a skill too, the emptying out. She had learned it the hard way years before she had learned anything else about medicine or war. Her phone had 2 messages on it. She read neither. When Deb found her in the hallway, the younger nurse looked like she'd been working up the courage to speak for several minutes. She stood at the end of the corridor holding her own coffee and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Where did you learn to place a chest tube like that?" Sarah looked at her. "Nursing school." Deb didn't look convinced, but she also didn't push it. She leaned against the wall instead. "Dr. Thompson is writing something up. An incident report, I think." "Okay." "Doesn't that bother you?" Sarah thought about it for an honest second. "What bothers me is a 22-year-old dying because someone waited for proper authorization." She finished her coffee. "The incident report is paperwork. Specialist Cho is alive. I know which one I care about." Deb was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You're not like the other nurses." Sarah stood up, crumpled the cup. "You should eat something before the next rotation. It's going to be a long night." She walked back toward the ward. Behind her, Deb stood in the hallway and watched her go, holding her coffee with both hands, the same look on her face that Marcus Hayes had worn for 11 weeks. The night shift was quieter, which in a field hospital meant a different kind of tense. The daytime chaos was replaced by the low-level vigilance of the dark hours, the constant monitoring, the soft alarms, the occasional sound of someone in pain finding the edges of their medication. Sarah moved through the ward on soft feet, checking vitals, adjusting drips, pausing at each bed long enough to see the whole patient and not just the chart. Bed 12 held a soldier named Private First Class Elijah Torres, 19 years old, who had come in with the convoy that morning. His injuries were the least severe of the critical cases, a significant laceration to his right arm and a concussion that the attending had already cleared, but he was awake at midnight, staring at the ceiling with the look of someone who had replayed the same 20 seconds approximately 800 times in the past 12 hours. Sarah stopped at his bed. She didn't say anything at first. She checked his monitor, looked at his IV line, and adjusted his arm on the pillow. "You can't sleep," she said. Not a question. "No, ma'am." "Do you want something for it?" He was quiet. "Then I keep seeing Cooper." His voice had the careful flatness of someone trying very hard not to cry. "He was right next to me, and then I don't know how to..." He stopped. Sarah pulled the chair beside his bed and sat down. She leaned forward with her forearms on her knees the way a person sits when they're settling in rather than passing through. What was his name? His full name? Elijah blinked. Cooper. Daniel Cooper. From Georgia. How long had you known him? Since basic, 14 months. She nodded slowly. That's a long time in military terms. Yeah, he swallowed hard. I keep thinking I should have, I don't know, done something different. Moved left instead of right, maybe. Or grabbed him faster. Listen to me. Her voice was quiet and direct, no softness in it that would make him feel managed. What happened to Daniel Cooper was not determined by where you stepped. It was determined by physics and timing and things that were outside your control from the moment you woke up that morning. You know that. She held his gaze. And knowing it doesn't make it easier. Those are two different things. One is true and the other is real, and you're going to have to hold both of them for a long time. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was steady. You sound like you know something about that. She sat with that for a moment. Get some rest, Torres. The hard part starts when the adrenaline wears off and you need to be as strong as you can for it. She stood, replaced the chair, and moved to the next bed. Elijah Torres watched her walk away and found to his surprise that the ceiling didn't seem quite as oppressive as it had 10 minutes ago. He still replayed the 20 seconds, but it was slower now somehow, less like drowning and more like waiting. Marcus Hayes was awake too. He'd heard the quiet conversation from 2 beds down. He hadn't caught all the words, but he'd caught the tone, and the tone had hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He lay in the dark and stared up at the buzzing light above his bed and thought about a woman who placed chest tubes and spoke to traumatized teenagers at midnight and moved through a military hospital like she'd been trained for something much harder than nursing. He thought about what he'd said to her that morning. You move like somebody who's been downrange before. And what she'd said back. I move like somebody who's good at her job, which was true. But Marcus Hayes had spent 12 years reading people in environments where reading people wrong got you killed, and he was increasingly certain that Sarah Bennett's job, her real job, whatever that was something she had never once put on a badge. He made a decision then, lying in bed 5 at midnight, that he was going to find out who Sarah Bennett actually was. He had no idea that the answer was coming to him. 2 days after the convoy arrived, the hospital received a transfer request from command. A high-value military officer, Colonel James Whitfield, was being moved from a forward position to the base hospital for treatment of a serious infection that had spread further than initially assessed. The transfer was standard protocol. The security detail that came with him was not. 6 armed escorts for a colonel with a blood infection. Sarah clocked it the moment the convoy pulled in. She was standing at the nurse's station when the detail arrived, and she counted them without moving her head, counted their positions, the way they staggered their formation, the points they instinctively covered. She recognized the pattern. It wasn't standard military police. It was something more specific. She felt something shift very quietly in her chest, the way a compass needle shifts when it picks up a field. She went back to her chart and said nothing. Colonel Whitfield was installed in the private room at the end of the ward, the one with reinforced walls and a single window that faced the interior courtyard. His details set up in the hallway outside. Sarah watched from the nurse's station as 2 of them entered the room with him and 2 others took positions at either end of the corridor. What's going on? Deb asked, appearing at her elbow. VIP patient, Sarah said. That's a lot of security for a sick colonel. Yeah, Sarah said, it is. She looked at the door at the end of the ward, then back at her chart. Her expression gave nothing away, but behind her eyes, something was running a quiet, rapid calculation. Something that had been dormant for 11 weeks. Something old and trained and very awake. Thompson appeared from the direction of the private room, his face neutral in a way that Sarah had learned to read as concern he was trying not to show. He stopped at the nurse's station. Bennett, she looked up. You're on primary care for the colonel starting tonight. She held his gaze. Why me? Because you're the best person I have on night shift, and I don't want to hear that I said so. He looked back at his clipboard, but not before she caught the edge of something almost genuine in his expression. His condition is more complicated than the intake forms indicated. I'll brief you at 1900. He walked away. Sarah stood at the nurse's station and felt the hospital rearrange itself around her. She felt the weight of the security detail down the corridor. She felt the quiet wrongness of 6 armed escorts for a medical transfer. She felt somewhere below all of it the familiar pressure of a situation that was about to become something other than what it appeared. She picked up her chart. She had 6 hours before the briefing. She used every one of them. She read Whitfield's transfer documents twice. She memorized his vitals trend. She walked the perimeter of the ward twice during her rounds, noting everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. She spoke to each member of the security detail once briefly professionally under the cover of routine nursing questions about whether anyone needed water or medical attention, and she listened to how they answered and to what they didn't say. By the time 1900 came, Sarah Bennett knew 3 things that were not in any file in the hospital. She knew that Colonel Whitfield was not being moved for medical reasons alone. She knew that at least one member of the security detail was not who his identification said he was. And she knew with a cold and quiet certainty that she had felt only a handful of times before that something was coming. She didn't know what shape it would take or when it would arrive, but it was coming. She went into Thompson's briefing, sat down across from him, and listened to his medical summary of the colonel's condition. She asked the right clinical questions. She took the right notes. And the whole time underneath all of it, she was doing what she had always done, what 11 weeks of playing a rookie nurse had not touched, what no amount of time or distance had ever quite managed to turn off. She was preparing. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Thompson talked about bacterial infection, antibiotic resistance, fluid management. The colonel's elevated inflammatory markers. He used the right words in the right order, and Sarah listened to all of it, and when he was done, she asked 2 clinical questions and wrote down the answers and stood to leave. Then she stopped at the door. "Who authorized the security detail configuration?" she asked. Her voice was professional. Curious even, just a nurse asking a logistical question. Thompson looked up from his papers. "Command sent it with the transfer order. Why? Just want to know the chain of contact if there's a medical emergency and I need to move the patient quickly." She paused. 6 armed personnel in a hospital corridor creates a lot of obstacles. Thompson studied her for a moment. "Talk to the detail lead. A man named Ferris. He's the one in the gray jacket." "Thank you, doctor." She walked out. Ferris was standing at the east end of the corridor, one shoulder against the wall, arms loose at his sides. Medium height, compact build, the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation. It was readiness, dressed up as relaxation. Sarah knew the difference the way she knew her own heartbeat. She walked up to him with her chart tucked under her arm and her ID badge visible and her entire posture calibrated to say, "Nurse on rounds, nothing more." "Mr. Ferris," she said. He looked at her. His eyes did a fast sweep, face hands, badge posture, and came back to her face. "That's right. I'm the primary nurse on Colonel Whitfield's care tonight. I want to coordinate with you on emergency protocols. If his condition deteriorates and we need to move him fast, I need to know your team's procedure for clearing the corridor." Ferris looked at her for a beat longer than the question required. "We clear on command from the detail lead." "That's me. And if I can't reach you in time, you reach me." She held his gaze. "Understood." She made a small note on her chart. "One more thing, is anyone on your team on any medications I should know about, blood thinners, anything that could be a factor in an emergency?" It was a routine question. She asked it to every security team that came through. But she asked it because of what it revealed, not the answer, but the hesitation before the answer. Ferris said no, immediately. No pause, no thought. Sarah smiled briefly and walked toward the colonel's room. She'd gotten what she came for. A man who genuinely had no medications to report would have taken a half second to actually consider the question. Ferris hadn't considered it. He'd deflected it. And deflection wasn't the same as honesty. Colonel Whitfield was awake when she entered. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, even in a hospital bed, with the particular kind of authority that doesn't disappear when you take off the uniform. His face was gray with fever, but his eyes were sharp and tracking, and they fixed on Sarah the moment she came through the door. "You're the night nurse," he said. "Sarah Bennett. How are you feeling, Colonel?" "Like I'm running a fever and being watched by people I don't entirely trust." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "Sit down, Nurse Bennett." She sat. He looked at her with those sharp, feverish eyes. Thompson says you're good. Thompson says that reluctantly and only under duress. The colonel almost smiled. It pulled at something tight in his face. He's a good doctor. Not great with people, but good with medicine. He shifted against his pillow and she saw the effort it cost him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. All right. Is there anyone on my detail who has requested access to this room in the last 6 hours? Anyone who tried to come in without a medical reason? Sarah didn't let her expression change, but something in her chest went very quiet and very alert. Why are you asking me that? Because I've been doing this long enough to know when something is wrong with my own security. His jaw was tight. One of the men outside that door is not who he says he is. I've suspected it since before I was transferred. I don't know which one, and I am stuck in a hospital bed with a 103-degree fever, which limits my options considerably. Sarah looked at him steadily. She thought about Ferris and his instant deflection. She thought about the formation she'd read in the security detail, the way 2 of the positions didn't quite fit standard protective service protocol. She thought about the compass needle in her chest and how it had been pointing at this moment for 2 days. Colonel, she said, I need you to trust me. You're a nurse. I know what I am. She held his gaze. Do you trust me or not? He looked at her for a long time. The monitor beside him beeped steadily. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. My instinct says yes, he finally said. I've learned not to argue with my instinct. Good. She stood. Don't let anyone into this room tonight except me and Thompson. No exceptions, not command, not the detail, not anyone. If someone tells you it's an emergency, you call for me first. He frowned. What do you know? I know that 6 armed escorts for a medical transfer is unusual. I know that your lead detail man has a reflex pattern that doesn't match his stated background. And I know that someone who wanted to reach you would plan for the moment when you were most vulnerable. She looked at the IV line, checked the drip rate, made a note. A hospital in the middle of a combat zone is a good place to make something look like a medical incident. The colonel was very still. How do you know about reflex patterns? Sarah picked up her chart. Get some sleep, Colonel. Your fever needs to come down. She walked out of the room. In the corridor, she passed Ferris without looking at him. She walked back to the nurse's station, sat down, and opened a chart that she didn't read. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her mind was running at a speed that had nothing to do with nursing school in Virginia. Marcus Hayes was watching her from bed 5. He'd been watching since she came out of the colonel's room because he'd watched her go in, and something about the deliberate calm of her walk had told him in the way that 12 years of reading situations told a person things that whatever had just happened in that room was not routine. Bennett, he called. She looked over. Come here a second. She walked over, pulled out his chart, made it look like rounds. How's the leg? The leg's fine. What's going on with Whitfield? She kept her eyes on the chart. Colonel Whitfield is a patient with a systemic infection. Nothing more to discuss. You went in there looking like a nurse, Marcus said quietly, and you came out looking like something else. She didn't answer. I've been watching you for 2 weeks, he said. I don't know who you are, but I know what you're not. You're not just a nurse. He kept his voice low below the ambient noise of the ward. And whatever's in that room at the end of the corridor, you think it's a threat. She finally looked at him, really looked at him the way she hadn't let herself look at anyone here, direct and unguarded, for exactly 2 seconds. Then it was gone. You need to rest, Sergeant. You're still recovering. Sarah. He said her name like he was nailing it down. Whatever you're planning, you shouldn't do it alone. She set the chart back in its holder. I'm a nurse, she said. I'm planning to finish my rounds. She walked away, but Marcus Hayes sat up a little straighter in his bed and did not close his eyes. The call came at 2 in the morning, not a radio burst or an alarm, a single flat sound from the monitor in the colonel's room that the staff recognized as a deterioration alert. Sarah was already moving before the sound finished, pulling gloves from her pocket, heading down the corridor at a pace that was faster than walking, but hadn't yet become running. She was 4 beds away when she saw the door to the colonel's room push open from the inside. Not Thompson, not a nurse, Ferris. He was halfway through the door, his hand on the frame, And when he saw Sarah coming, he paused just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that only registers if you're looking for it. Then he smoothed his expression and stepped fully into the corridor. "Nurse," his monitor went off. "I heard it," Shira said. She kept walking. "I'll handle it. I should come in." "Security personnel don't enter the patient's room without medical staff present." She was at the door now. "That's the protocol I confirmed with you 6 hours ago." She held the door. "Step back, please." His eyes went flat. Something underneath his face shifted, and for a half second the man named Ferris, who was wearing the face of a detail lead, showed her something else. Something colder, something that had made a calculation and was still running the numbers. Then he stepped back. Of course. Sarah went in. The colonel was awake. He was sitting up, his hand on the call button, his face tight with more than fever. He looked at her the moment she entered, and what she saw in his expression confirmed it. "Someone touched my IV line," he said, quiet and certain. I felt the pressure change. Sarah crossed to the IV stand in 3 steps. She didn't examine it slowly. Her eyes read it in seconds, the slight discoloration where the secondary port met the line, a film at the junction point that hadn't been there at 2200 when she'd last checked. She pulled the line. "What is it?" the colonel asked. "Nothing that's in you anymore." She reached for the call button and held it. "I need you to trust me for the next 60 seconds. Can you do that?" "Yes." She pressed the call button twice, 2 short pulses, not the standard single press for routine assistance. It was a signal she had not used in 3 years. She had no reason to believe anyone in this building would recognize it. But she pressed it because some habits don't die, no matter how long you bury them, and some signals are muscle memory. Then she turned back to the colonel. "I'm going to move your IV to a new line. Don't drink anything, don't accept anything from anyone except me or Dr. Thompson tonight. When Thompson arrives in the morning, tell him you need a full line change and new fluids. Tell him it's your request." "You think they got something into my line?" "I think someone tried." She was already pulling a new IV kit. "I don't think they succeeded, but I'm not willing to assume." "Who are these people?" "That's a longer conversation." She worked quickly, efficiently. "Who knows you're here? Specifically, who knew the timing of your transfer?" The colonel's jaw worked. "Command staff, my executive officer. The detail was assigned through a department I don't directly oversee." He paused. "And a contractor, a logistics contractor who coordinated the medical transfer." "Name?" he told her. Sarah filed it away in the part of her mind that didn't forget things. She finished the IV line, checked his vitals, and stood. "Your fever is up. I'm going to get Thompson." "It's 2 in the morning." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Someone tried to put something in your line tonight, Colonel. You don't sleep unmonitored, and I don't take chances with things like this." She called Thompson from the corridor phone away from Ferris's position, and when Thompson answered on the 4th ring, with the voice of a man dragged out of sleep, she said, "I need you here now, Colonel Whitfield. Something's wrong with his line, and I think we need to talk about his security arrangement." Thompson was silent for a moment. "Then I'll be there in 10 minutes. Come to the side entrance." Another pause. "Why?" "Because I'm asking you to," she said and hung up. When she came back down the corridor, Ferris was still at his position. He watched her with those flat, calculating eyes. The other detail member at the corridor's end hadn't moved. Everything looked exactly as it should look at 2 in the morning in a military hospital, which was precisely what made the back of Sarah's neck go tight. She stopped at the nurse's station, pretended to update a chart. From this position, she could see both ends of the corridor, the door to Whitfield's room, the secondary entrance in bed 5 where Marcus Hayes was not sleeping. He was sitting up watching her with the patient-focused attention of a man who had been trained to wait. Their eyes met across the ward. He raised his chin slightly, a question. She gave the smallest movement of her head. "Not yet." He settled back, but he didn't close his eyes. Thompson arrived through the side entrance. 11 minutes later, his hair flattened on one side, his coat thrown on over what were clearly pajama pants. He looked at Sarah the moment he came through the door, and she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not irritation, not the authority reflex. Concern. Actual unguarded concern. "What happened?" he said. "Walk with me," she said quietly, "and don't look at the detail." They walked toward the supply room. She pulled the door closed behind them. In the 10 seconds it took her to do that, she told him the IV line, the discoloration at the junction, Ferris and his reflex patterns, the colonel's own suspicion about his detail. Thompson listened to all of it without interrupting, which she noted because Thompson's default mode was to interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 3 seconds. Then he said, "How do you know what a compromised IV junction looks like?" "Advanced training," she said. "That's not a nursing school answer." She looked at him. "No, it's not." He stared at her. In the harsh light of the supply room with his hair sideways and his pajama pants and his unguarded face, Raymond Thompson looked less like an authority figure and more like a man who was genuinely frightened and trying not to show it. "What do we do?" he said. Sarah had been running the calculations since the moment she'd pulled the IV line. She had variables she didn't have enough data to resolve how many compromised individuals, whether the threat was internal or had external coordination, whether tonight's attempt was preliminary or primary. She had assets she could work with her own training Thompson, who was now aware and cooperative, Marcus Hayes, who was mobile enough to be useful and smart enough to follow a lead in the layout of a hospital she had memorized on day one. What she didn't have was backup. "We need to move the colonel," she said. "Somewhere in this building that the detail doesn't have the layout for. We do it quietly, we do it in the next hour, and we don't tell anyone except the people we absolutely have to." You're describing a covert patient transfer in a military hospital in the middle of the night," Thompson said. "Yes." "That's insane. What's insane is leaving a high-value target in a room that someone already accessed tonight." Her voice was steady and final. "I need you to decide, doctor. Right now. Are you in or not?" Thompson ran a hand through his already sideways hair. He looked at the supply room door and then at Sarah, and she could see the moment the calculation completed in his face, the moment he stopped weighing his professional authority against her certainty and simply chose to trust the certainty. "Tell me what you need," he said. "A medical reason to move the patient, documentation, and your cooperation when I ask for it, no questions in the moment." "Done." He straightened up. "And Bennett, when this is over, you and I are going to have a very specific conversation about who you actually are." She almost said something, then she didn't. "Let's get through tonight first." She pulled the supply room door open and walked back into the corridor. Ferris was still at his position. He watched her emerge from the supply room with Thompson, and she saw his eyes move a fractional calculation. She kept her pace even and her expression clinically concerned, the exact face a nurse makes when a patient's condition has developed a complication. She and Thompson walked together toward Whitfield's room, and she felt Ferris's attention on her back like a physical weight. She did not turn around. Inside the colonel's room, Thompson took vitals and reviewed the lines Sarah had replaced and said the words she needed him to say. The colonel required an imaging procedure. The equipment was in the south wing. They would need to move him now. He said it all with the smooth authority of a senior physician, and the colonel listened, and the colonel trusted it because Sarah was standing at the foot of the bed looking like a woman who had already made the decision and needed everyone else to catch up. "I'll inform the detail," Ferris said from the doorway. "No need," Thompson said. "This is a medical movement. Security doesn't need to be present for an imaging procedure. Your team can hold the corridor." Ferris's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Protocol requires medical protocol supersedes security protocol in a clinical environment," Thompson said. "That's in the base agreement signed by base command. If you want to call Colonel Whitfield's commanding officer at 2:30 in the morning to confirm, you are welcome to do that." He picked up the colonel's chart and made a note with the specific energy of a man who was very done with the conversation. The silence stretched for 4 long seconds. "We hold the corridor," Ferris said. "Thank you," Thompson said. They moved the colonel out of the room. 6 minutes later, Sarah on one side of the bed, Thompson on the other, a transport monitor clipped to the rail. They went through the connecting door at the south end of the ward, the one that required a staff keycard, Sarah's keycard, and that opened onto the physical therapy corridor. It was the only section of the hospital that wasn't on the main security team's posted map because it had been added in a renovation 18 months ago. She knew this because she had read the renovation records on day 4. She had read them the way she read everything in this building, not because she expected to need them, but because need had a way of arriving without invitation. The colonel looked at her as they moved through the dim corridor. You planned for this, he said. I planned for a lot of things, Sarah said. Who trained you? She looked straight ahead. Keep your voice down, Colonel. He obeyed, but he kept looking at her, and what was in his eyes now was not the suspicion of a sick man being moved by a stranger. It was something closer to recognition, the expression of someone who has identified a member of the tribe they thought they were alone in. They got the colonel to the South Imaging suite and repositioned him with a new monitor and a locked door between him and the corridor. Thompson stood at the door with his arms crossed, in his pajama pants, in his genuine grudging clear-as-glass fear, and Sarah looked at him and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel about people she was protecting, something that was almost warmth. Stay with him, she said. No one comes in. If anyone knocks, call me first. Thompson nodded. Where are you going? She was already at the door. Back to the ward. She had to get back before Ferris realized the patient had been moved and started running his own calculation. She had maybe 5 minutes. She needed 4. She moved through the connecting corridor at a pace she hadn't used in 11 weeks. Not a run because running in a hospital drew eyes, but the rapid, soundless walk of someone who had been trained to cover ground without being noticed. Her mind was running 3 threads simultaneously: the corridor layout, the details, likely response time, the question of who the second compromised individual was, because Ferris had a partner, she was certain of that, and she didn't know which one of the other 5 members it was. She came back through the staff entrance into the main ward. She was 3 steps in when she heard it. A sound from the direction of Whitfield's now empty room, a sound that was not the click of someone finding an empty bed, but the sound of equipment being moved. Fast, not a nurse's sound. She turned. The door to the colonel's room was open. Light spilled from inside. And standing in the corridor between that room and the nurse's station was a member of the security detail she had categorized as probable, legitimate, a younger man, stocky, who she had mentally cleared based on his positioning and his movements. He was not cleared anymore. He had a small device in his hand, the kind used to transmit encrypted signals, and he was looking at it with the focused expression of someone who had just discovered that his primary objective was no longer in the room where it was supposed to be. He looked up. He saw her, and Sarah Bennett stood in the dim ward at 2:47 in the morning and looked back at him, and everything she had kept quiet and still for 11 weeks came fully quietly awake. The man with the transmitter device was running his own calculations. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way his weight had shifted fractionally onto his back foot. He was deciding, fight or signal or run. He had a sidearm under his jacket. She'd clocked it during her round's left hip cross-draw configuration. She was 22 feet away, unarmed in scrubs, standing in a hospital ward at 2:47 in the morning. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 22 feet was not nearly enough distance to make her a safe problem. She made her decision first. Drop it, she said, quiet, absolute. The voice she used wasn't the nurse's voice, and she didn't try to make it one. It was something older than that, something that came from a place she had spent 11 weeks keeping the door closed on. It came out natural. It came out like coming home. The man's eyes shifted to the transmitter in his hand to her, to the door behind her back to her face. I said drop it. She took 1 step forward. Just 1. But the way she took it made him step back. He dropped the device. It hit the floor, and she was already moving not toward him, toward the device. She kicked it kishbadways along the baseboard out of his reach, and in the same motion she came up inside his space, her right hand going to his wrist before he could complete the reach for the sidearm. She had his arm locked in a control hold that removed the option entirely, and she put him against the wall with a controlled force that was not brutal, but was absolutely final. Don't, she said close to his ear. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Nod if you understand. He nodded. His breathing was fast and ragged. Who's your contact outside this building? He said nothing. She adjusted the hold. The pressure point she'd found was specific and unambiguous. He made a sound through clenched teeth. Who is your contact? I can't. You can. She eased the pressure by a fraction. I'm going to give you one more chance before this gets significantly less comfortable. Who is running this operation? From the far end of the corridor came the sound of movement. She registered it without turning footsteps, 2 sets coming from the direction of the main entrance. Ferris, and at least one more. She made a decision in under a second. She released the man's step back and said, in a completely different voice, The nurse's voice calm and measured. Sir, I need you to return to your assigned position. This area is restricted to medical personnel. The man stared at her. His wrist was still held against his chest. He was breathing hard. And then because she was extraordinary at reading people, because she had spent years learning to read the exact moment when a person tips from resistance to cooperation, she saw it in his face. The shift, the decision. Ferris is going to know, he said, low, urgent. He's going to know the patient isn't in the room. When he finds out, he already knows the room is empty, Sarah said, which means we have about 90 seconds before he decides what to do about it. So talk to me. Fast. The man looked at the corridor, looked at her, swallowed. The contractor, the logistics contractor who set up the transfer. He's the one running it. Ferris works for him. I was supposed to confirm when the primary objective was isolated. He shook his head. I didn't know it was going to go this far. I thought it was intelligence collection. I didn't know about the line. The IV line, Sarah said. Yes. His jaw was tight. When I found out what Ferris put in the line, I was trying to transmit a abort signal, not a confirmation, an abort. He met her eyes. I swear to you. She looked at him for 2 seconds. It wasn't enough time to verify anything, and she knew it, and she acted on it anyway because the alternative was worse. What's Ferris's plan when he can't find the colonel? He'll go loud. He has a secondary protocol. If the primary objective can't be reached through the medical approach, he initiates a hard extraction. He has 2 men positioned outside who aren't part of the posted detail. Everything in the ward went very still in Sarah's mind. Not panic clarity, the cold, bright clarity that she had been trained to access and that 11 weeks of nursing rounds had not touched at all. How many total, she said. Outside 2, inside Ferris, and 1 more from the detail. 4 total. Armed with what? Ferris carries a suppressed sidearm, the other is same. The 2 outside have automatic weapons. She looked at the ward around her. 31 patients, 3 nursing staff on the night shift including herself. 1 surgeon in a locked room with the colonel. 1 sergeant with a recovering leg wound who had been watching her with the focused attention of a man waiting to be asked. She looked back at the man against the wall. What's your name? He hesitated. Garrett. Garrett, I need you to do something for me. What? Go back to your position. Behave normally for as long as you can. If Ferris asks you if the room is empty, tell him you checked and the patient was still there. She held his gaze. Buy me 10 minutes. Garrett stared at her. You're a nurse. I know what I am, she said. 10 minutes, Garrett. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment, at her scrubs, her badge, her completely steady hands, and something in his face went through a rapid and complete revision. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I can do that. He straightened up and adjusted his jacket and walked back toward his position at the corridor's far end. Sarah picked up the transmitter device from the baseboard and put it in her scrub pocket. Then she walked directly to bed 5. Marcus Hayes was already sitting up. He had been sitting up since the sound of the confrontation which he had heard and correctly categorized even from 40 feet away. When she came into his bedside, he looked at her face and didn't bother with questions. How bad, he said. 4 operatives, 2 outside. Ferris and 1 other inside. She kept her voice low and her back to the corridor. They're going to go loud when Ferris confirms the colonel isn't where he's supposed to be. I have maybe 8 minutes, probably less. Weapons? Suppressed sidearms inside, automatic outside. She looked at his leg. Can you walk? I've been walking to the bathroom for 3 days without telling anyone. She almost smiled. I need you to do something for me. Name it. There's a weapons locker in the supply room at the south end of this ward. It's not on the staff access list, but it's there. The base added it during the last security review. The code is 8741. She watched his face. I need you to get there, get it open, and bring me whatever's inside. Marcus Hayes looked at her with an expression that had moved very far past surprise and arrived somewhere in the territory of absolute unwavering certainty. You know the code to a weapons locker that isn't on the staff access list? Yes, because you're not actually just a nurse. We can have that conversation later. Right now, I need you moving. He swung his legs off the bed. She put her hand on his arm, not stopping him, steadying him. Carefully. I've had worse. He stood, tested the leg, made no sound about what that cost him. Yad 741, South Supply Room. Go through the linen corridor. Don't let the detail see you. He moved. He was slower than he wanted to be, and faster than any recently wounded man had a right to be, and Sarah watched him disappear through the linen corridor door before she turned back to the ward. She had 8 patients who were mobile enough to be a problem or an asset depending on how the next several minutes went. She had 2 other nurses, Deb on the east end of the ward, a male nurse named Price on the west, who were going to be in the middle of this, whether they understood it or not. She had 31 patients who needed to be in their beds and not in the line of what was coming. She went to Deb first. Deb was at the medication cart sorting the 3 a.m. distribution. She looked up when Sarah appeared at her elbow, registered Sarah's expression, and immediately set down what she was holding. What's wrong? I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I say. I'll explain everything when it's over. Sarah kept her voice completely level. I need you to move every patient who can be moved to the East Ward starting right now. Tell them it's a heating issue. Tell them anything. Just get them moving calmly, no panic. Deb's face had gone very still. Sarah, Deb, her name quiet and direct. I need you to trust me. Right now, can you do that? Deb swallowed. Yes. Go. She found Price on the west side and told him the same thing, a different cover story, a medical equipment issue, same goal. He was older than Deb, steadier, and he looked at her for exactly 1 second before he nodded and started moving. She had given herself 8 minutes. She was now at 6. She walked back to the nurse's station and called the South Imaging Suite. Thompson picked up on the first ring, which told her he hadn't slept. It's me, she said. Lock the door. Don't open it for anything until you hear my voice on the other side. The colonel is not to move, not to speak to anyone who calls through the door, and not to touch anything electronic. What's happening? Thompson's voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. Armed individuals inside the building. I'm handling it. A pause that contained an enormous amount of suppressed reaction. You're handling it. Yes, keep the door locked. She hung up. 5 minutes. She went to the supply cabinet at the nurse's station and took out what she needed, not medical supplies. The base had conducted a security update 6 months ago, and as part of that update, certain items had been distributed to field hospital nursing stations under sealed orders that most of the staff had never opened because the sealed orders looked like standard regulatory paperwork, and nobody read standard regulatory paperwork. Sarah had read it on day 2. She had the contents of the sealed kit in her hands when she heard the change in the corridor. It was a sound that wasn't a sound in absence. The particular quiet that falls when people who have been maintaining a cover stop, maintaining it. She heard Ferris's voice low and clipped, and then a response she couldn't make out, and then the sound of movement that was no longer pretending to be anything other than what it was. 4 minutes. She had burned 4 of her 8 minutes. She moved to the connecting doorway at the north end of the ward, the one that gave her a sight line to the main corridor. She pressed herself to the wall beside it and listened. Ferris's voice closer now. East Wing, he's somewhere in the East Wing. Medical cover, they moved him during shift. Find the surgeon. A pause. Chen, go external. Tell the others to move to secondary positions. We are at hard protocol. There it was, the moment she'd been counting down to. She heard the main door open and close, Chen going to the 2 external operatives. That left Ferris and 1 more inside. 2 against 1 suppressed weapons in a building full of patients. Marcus came through the linen corridor door behind her. He was breathing harder than he wanted to, his jaw set against the effort of what the walk had cost his recovering leg. In his hands, he carried what the South supply locker had contained: 2 M9 service pistols fully loaded and a compact radio on the base security channel. He held them out to her. Sarah took one of the pistols. She looked at him. You sure about this? I've been sure since night 1, he said. Where do you want me? She looked at the ward, then back at him. Stay here. Cover this entrance. Anyone who comes through that isn't wearing scrubs, you challenge first. Only engage if you have to. She checked the M9 with the automatic fluency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The patients are being moved east. Deb and Price are handling it. You protect this corridor. Marcus looked at the pistol in his hand, then at her, at the composed and completely transformed person standing in front of him who was wearing a nurse's badge and handling a sidearm like she'd been born with one. "Who are you?" he said, not accusatory, genuinely needing to know. She looked at him for one honest second. "Someone who did this for a long time before I did the other thing." She moved toward the connecting door. "Stay down, Sergeant." She went through before he could say anything else. The main corridor was quiet in the way that means full. Ferris was at the east end, his back partially to her, speaking quietly into a comm. The second operative, she'd categorized him as the one posted near the medication room entrance, a tall man with close-cropped hair she'd noted as Riker, in her mental file, was moving toward the south wing access door, toward Thompson, toward the colonel. She made the threat assessment in the time it takes to exhale. Riker was the immediate danger. Ferris was 15 feet further and distracted by his comm. She moved down the corridor at a pace that was still technically a walk. She had 4 seconds before Riker reached the south wing door. She used 3 of them to close the distance, and on the 4th she said, "Riker." He turned. She hit him with a controlled strike to the throat, not hard enough to collapse the airway, hard enough to completely eliminate his ability to call out, and caught his arm as he went down, controlling the fall so it didn't ring out on the floor. She had his sidearm out of his holster before he'd finished going down, and she was back on her feet in under 3 seconds. Ferris heard something. He turned. He saw her. He saw Riker on the floor. He saw the 2 pistols. For one long, suspended second, he looked at her, at the scrubs, the badge, the face he'd been reading as hospital staff for 2 days, and she watched the full and complete revision happen behind his eyes, the calculation restarting from 0, the threat assessment hitting a number he hadn't budgeted for. "Who are you?" he said. His hand was moving toward his sidearm. "Don't," she said. It was the same word she'd used on Garrett, and it carried the same absolute weight. "I will not give you a second warning." His hand stopped. Sidearm on the floor. Slow. He didn't move. "Ferris." Her voice dropped to something very quiet and very direct. "I know your secondary team is outside. I know your protocol, and I know your timeline. I also know that this building has 31 patients who had nothing to do with whatever you were hired to accomplish tonight, and I am not going to let you anywhere near any of them." She took 1 step forward. "You are out of moves. Put the weapon on the floor." His jaw worked. His eyes moved across her, across the way she was standing, the way she held the weapons, the way she hadn't blinked. She watched him read her the way a man reads a landscape for cover, and finding none. "What are you?" he said. "Someone who is very tired of being underestimated," she said. "Last time, floor." His hand went to his holster, slowly, deliberately, and then with the tight, controlled motion of a man making a calculation he hates, he drew the weapon with 2 fingers and set it on the floor. She crossed to him in 4 steps and had him against the wall, in the same controlled hold she'd used on the man she'd decided not to be Garrett. She secured his hands with a zip tie from the sealed orders kit, standard restraint, non-medical use, the thing nobody had read the paperwork about, and she stepped back. "The 2 outside," she said. "Radio them in. Tell them the operation is compromised and to stand down." "I'm not going to." "You have a choice between standing down and what comes next," she said. "And what comes next involves base security and JAG and approximately 15 people with more authority than either of us who are going to want to know exactly who authorized this operation and exactly what was in that IV line." She held his gaze. "Or you can radio your men and we end this quietly. Your choice." Ferris was silent for 5 seconds. His face ran through several things and landed on something cold and calculating, and finally practical. He reached for his comm. He radioed the external team. He told them to stand down. Static, then a voice, "Copy, standing down." Sarah took the comm from him. She looked down the corridor, then back at Ferris, then at the south wing door that Thompson and the colonel were behind. The building was quiet, really quiet the way it only was in the small hours when the worst had passed and the staff were too tired to make noise. It was 20 minutes to 4 in the morning. Marcus came through the connecting door, moving carefully on his leg, and stopped when he saw Ferris against the wall and Riker on the floor, and Sarah standing between them with 2 sidearms and the exact expression of someone who has just completed an enormous amount of work and is already thinking about what comes next. He looked at all of it. He looked at her. Nursing school in Virginia, he said. Partially true, she said. He almost laughed. It came out instead as a long exhale and a slow shake of his head. What do we do now? She was already reaching for the radio he'd brought from the supply locker. She switched to the base security channel. She keyed the transmission. This is Bennett at the field hospital. I need the base duty officer, the base security commander, and someone from command intelligence. I have 2 secured individuals, a compromised security detail, and a high-value patient who needs immediate verification of protective services. She released the key. I also need someone to notify JAG that I have information on a logistics contractor named in the colonel's transfer documents. She looked at Ferris. And I need an IV sample preserved from the primary patient's compromised line, analyzed by a lab that isn't affiliated with the transfer contractor. She released the key and let the radio hiss. Then she looked at Marcus Hayes, who was leaning against the corridor wall with his arms crossed and his pistol at his side, and his face doing something she had never seen it do in 2 weeks of observation. He looked for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely unsure what to say. You want to sit down, she said. Your leg. My leg is fine, he said. Your leg is not fine. You walked on a healing shrapnel wound at 3 a.m. Yeah, well. He shifted his weight and she caught the wince he tried to suppress. Seemed like the situation called for it. She gestured to the wall beside him. Sit. I'll check it when this is done. He sat. He watched her move to secure Riker's wrist with a second zip tie, then check Ferris's restraints, then retrieve the comm devices and transmitters. He watched her do all of it with the precise, economical movements of someone for whom this kind of work was not exceptional. It was just work. Sarah, he said. She looked up. I have been in 3 combat deployments. His voice was quiet and level. I have worked alongside Ranger Special Forces, 2 CIA contractors, and a Marine raider who could dismantle a field radio in the dark in under 40 seconds. He held her gaze. You are not a nurse who happened to learn some extra skills. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I'm both things, Sergeant. I am exactly both things. And right now, the nurse part of me is looking at your leg and telling me you've probably aggravated that wound and are going to need a new dressing and possibly imaging in the morning. He stared at her. And the other part of me, she said, is waiting for base security to arrive so I can hand this off to people with the appropriate authority. She stood and dusted off her scrubbed knees and looked at him with an expression that was very steady and very real. And then I'm going to go check on my patients. The radio crackled. The duty officer's voice came through asking for confirmation of her transmission. Sarah keyed the radio and confirmed. Down the corridor behind a locked door in the South Imaging Suite, Colonel Whitfield sat in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm, and a surgeon in pajama pants who had not, despite considerable pressure, unlocked the door for anyone. And Thompson, sitting in a chair against the wall, was listening to the sound of what appeared to be a nurse handling a counterterrorism situation in the hallway of his hospital, and he was experiencing a profound and total revision of everything he had believed about the woman he had been dismissing for 11 weeks. He looked at the colonel. Are you going to tell me who she is? He said. Whitfield looked at the door. His face, even fever-flushed, had something in it that was close to pride. I think, he said, she's going to tell you herself. Base security arrived at 4:17 in the morning. Not the 2-man patrol that normally responded to hospital calls, but a full 8-person team with a duty officer leading and a woman in civilian clothes who carried no visible identification and whose presence at 4 in the morning in a forward base hospital told Sarah everything she needed to know about the chain of notification that had happened in the last hour. Intelligence. She was looking at someone from intelligence, and intelligence didn't show up at field hospitals at 4 in the morning for incidents that were actually as simple as they'd been reported. Sarah stood in the corridor with her badge visible and her hands empty. She'd handed the secured weapons to Marcus before the team arrived, a calculation she'd made without thinking about it because a nurse holding 2 sidearms was a conversation that couldn't be postponed, and she needed to control the order of conversations, and she watched the duty officer take in the scene. Ferris against the wall, wrists secured. Riker on the floor, conscious now, wrists secured, one hand at his throat where the strike had landed. The transmitter device in an evidence bag that she'd improvised from a specimen bag from the nurse's station supply. Everything documented in her handwriting on a nursing assessment form because it was the paper she had available, and the information on it was exactly as precise as anything the security team would have generated. The duty officer, a heavy-set man named Captain Briscoe, who had the look of someone who had been doing this particular job for too long, looked at the nursing assessment form she handed him and then looked at her. "You wrote this," he said. "Yes. At 3:46 in the morning. The timestamps are in the upper right corner of each page." He looked at the pages. He looked at her. "And you are," he checked his own paperwork, "Sarah Bennett, staff nurse 11 weeks on deployment." "That's what my personnel file says," she said. The woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. She was in her mid-40s, compact, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless it decided to. She looked at Sarah for 3 full seconds without speaking, which was its own kind of communication. Then she said, "Where's the Colonel's South Imaging Suite, room 4? Dr. Thompson is with him." Sarah held the woman's gaze. The Colonel's IV line was compromised at approximately 2:15. I pulled the line and replaced it before the substance could enter his system. I have the original line preserved in specimen containment at the nurse's station. It needs independent laboratory analysis, not base medical. Why not base medical? Because the logistics contractor who coordinated the Colonel's transfer has access to base medical's chain of supply, and until you've confirmed the extent of the penetration, I wouldn't trust any analysis that passes through that chain. The woman studied her for another moment. Then she turned to Briscoe and said, "Get the line." To Sarah, "Take me to the Colonel." They walked the corridor together, and Sarah was acutely aware of the way the woman moved beside her. Measuring, assessing, running the same kind of continuous environmental raid that Sarah ran herself. 2 people trained in the same school of suspicion walking down a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning with the particular courtesy of professionals who recognized each other. "You handled 4 operatives," the woman said. It wasn't a question. 2 inside. The external 2 stood down on comm order from Ferris. She paused. "I had help from Sergeant Hayes in bed 5. He secured a weapon from the South Supply Locker and covered the linen corridor entrance." "The South Supply Locker isn't on the staff access list." "No," Sarah agreed. They walked in silence for 4 steps. "I'm going to need your full name," the woman said. "Your real full name." "It is my real full name," Sarah said. "Sarah Ann Bennett, former Lieutenant, United States Navy. SEAL Qualified Combat Medic Team 9. Separated from active service 22 months ago under a classified administrative process." She kept walking. "My personnel file here is accurate in every detail it contains. It simply doesn't contain all of them." The woman stopped walking. Sarah stopped too. She turned and looked at her. "Team 9, the woman said. "Yes. That unit doesn't officially exist." "I'm aware." Something shifted in the woman's face, not softness, not surprise, but a specific kind of recognition that moved through her expression like a current. She looked at Sarah's badge, then at her face, then at the corridor around them. Then she said, "My name is Diana Reeves. I work for an office I'm not going to name, and you already know what that means." "It means this operation was bigger than a contractor with access to a transfer detail," Sarah said. "Yes." Reeves began walking again. "Walk with me." They moved toward the south wing, and Reeves spoke in the low, flat cadence of someone delivering a briefing in a compressed window. Colonel Whitfield had spent the last 8 months building a case against a procurement network operating inside military contracting, a network that had been diverting medical and tactical supply funds across 3 theaters. The network had reach into base logistics, transfer coordination, and at least 2 members of the command intelligence structure. The contractor named in the transfer documents was the financial center of the network. Whitfield was not simply a patient being moved for medical reasons. He was the primary witness in an investigation that had been ongoing for 2 years and was 3 weeks from prosecution. "Someone inside the investigation leaked the transfer timeline," Reeves said. "We suspected the safe move had been compromised. We didn't know how far in." "You didn't flag the detail before he was moved," Sarah said. "Not an accusation, an observation." Reeves was quiet for one beat. "We didn't have enough to pull the clearance without tipping the network that we knew. We were hoping the hospital transfer would look routine enough to..." She stopped. "To what?" Sarah said. "To buy time." Reeves's jaw was tight. We were wrong. Sarah absorbed this. She absorbed the particular weight of it, the fact that Colonel Whitfield had been moved into a compromised situation by people who knew it was compromised and had calculated that the risk was acceptable. She thought about the Colonel's fever and his sharp eyes and the way he'd said he'd suspected someone in his detail before the transfer and had reported it and been moved anyway. She thought about a 22-year-old named Torres who kept replaying 20 seconds he couldn't change. She thought about what it meant to be in a position where the people making the calls had different math than the people on the ground. She kept all of it off her face. "He's through here," she said, and knocked on the door of the South Imaging Suite. "Thompson, it's Bennett. I have base security and a federal officer. Open the door." A pause, the sound of a chair scraping. Then Thompson's voice, still thick with the effort of staying calm all night. "What's the code word?" Sarah blinked. "We didn't establish a code word, Thompson." "I know, but I needed to hear your voice before I opened the door." A click and the door swung inward. Thompson stood in the doorway in his pajama pants and his doctor's coat, his hair a full disaster, his face carrying 11 hours of sustained, controlled fear, like a man who had been white-knuckling a cliff edge and was only now letting himself look down. He looked at Sarah and then at Reeves and then at the security team behind them, and he let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since 2 in the morning. "Colonel Whitfield," Reeves said, moving past him into the room. The colonel was sitting up in bed, his color better than it had been at midnight, his eyes sharp and tracking despite the fever. He looked at Reeves and his jaw tightened. "Diana." "James." She stopped at the foot of his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone tried to put something in my IV line while I was sleeping." His voice was dry and precise. "My nurse caught it." Reeves looked back at Sarah in the doorway. "She did. She also moved me through a locked corridor at 2:30 in the morning and told me not to open the door for anyone." His eyes went to Sarah. "I want to know who she is, fully, no partial file." The room was very quiet. Reeves looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the colonel. And Thompson standing to the side with his arms folded and his face doing the same complete revision it had been doing at various stages since 1900. The night before looked between all three of them with the expression of a man watching a layer of reality peel back from something he'd been standing on without knowing it. "I think," Sarah said, "that conversation is above my clearance to initiate." "It's not above mine," Reeves said. She turned to the colonel. "Her name is Lieutenant Sarah Bennett. She separated from Team 9 22 months ago after a classified operation in which she was the sole survivor of a 6-person element. The separation was administrative and not punitive. She requested it herself." The colonel went very still. Thompson said quietly, "Team 9. Nobody explained it to him. He looked at Sarah and didn't ask again. "The operation," the colonel said. His voice had changed. It was quieter, and under the quiet was something careful and genuine. "The one in Kandahar, 18 months ago." 22 months, Sarah said. 6 people went in." "Yes." He looked at her. A long, specific, weighted look that passed between them over everything that didn't need to be said and arrived at something that was simply human. 2 people who understood a particular kind of loss looking at each other across a hospital room at 4:30 in the morning. "I'm sorry," he said, "for your team." She nodded once. "Thank you, Colonel." Thompson had gone completely still. He was looking at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not the authority reflexes, not the contempt, not even the grudging professional respect she'd caught glimpses of over the past week. This was something stripped down to the bone. Raw recognition. The look of a man who had been very wrong about something for a very long time and was only now understanding the full scale of it. "Bennett," he said. She looked at him. "I wrote an incident report." He stopped. 3 of them, actually, over the past 2 weeks. "I know. I need to," he stopped again. Raymond Thompson, who had never in 11 weeks run out of words, stood in a room at 4:30 in the morning in his pajama pants and couldn't finish a sentence. He pushed his hand through his wrecked hair. "I owe you an apology. Several of them." "You were doing your job," she said. "I was being an ass," he said. "There's a difference and we both know it." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest shifted not toward warmth exactly, but toward something honest. "Yeah," she said. "There is." She held his gaze. "Apology accepted, Doctor." He nodded. Once tight like a man who wasn't accustomed to needing to do it and was determined to do it right anyway. Reeves had been watching this exchange with the practiced neutrality of someone who categorizes human moments and files them for later. She turned back to the colonel. We need to discuss next steps. The contractor is going to know the operation failed within the hour if he doesn't already. His people are in our custody, but he'll have a cutout protocol. He'll run, the colonel said. He'll try. Reeves's voice was flat. We have his financial network flagged. The prosecution file is secure. What we need is the physical evidence from tonight in the I-5, line the transmitter, the identities of the operatives added to the existing case record. She looked at Sarah. And we need a witness statement from the person who secured it. Sarah had been waiting for this. Not dreading it, she'd known it was coming from the moment she'd keyed the radio at 3:50. But there was a weight to it, the way there was always a weight to the moment when the door to the life you'd been living quietly opened all the way and let in the life you'd been living before. I'll give you everything I have, she said, on the record. Reeves nodded. I'll need you in debrief at 0800. I have a shift at 0700. Reeves looked at her. My patients still need care, Sarah said. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same quiet finality she used for everything. I'll give you everything you need after my shift. Thompson made a sound. It was small and involuntary, and it might have been under other circumstances the beginning of a laugh. He turned it into a cough. Reeves studied Sarah for a moment. Then for the first time since she'd arrived, the controlled professional face shifted slightly, just at the corners, just enough to be real. 0900, she said, and not a minute before. Sarah nodded. I'll be there. She walked back to the main ward. The ward at 5 in the morning had the particular quality of a place that had been through something and was now pretending it hadn't. The patients who'd been moved to the East Wing had been settled back into their beds by Deb and Price, who had told them the heating issue was resolved and offered everyone extra blankets as a buffer against any lingering questions. Most of the patients had accepted this without comment because soldiers learn early that unexplained things happen and that demanding explanations usually just gets you explanations you weren't ready for. Deb was at the nurse's station when Sarah came through. She looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman who had spent 3 hours following instructions she didn't understand and was now deciding whether to demand answers or simply accept the fact that the world was larger than she'd known. Everyone is back in their home, she said. Good. Sarah checked the monitor board. Torres, asleep, finally. Deb paused. Price took the early rounds. He said you'd need a minute. Sarah looked at her. Price was 54 years old and had been nursing in military contexts for 16 years. And had the particular quality of experienced people who understand when to step forward and when to step back. She made a note to tell him she appreciated it. Deb, she said, yeah, you did well tonight. Deb let out a breath that she'd clearly been sitting on for some time. I had no idea what I was doing. That's not true. You moved 15 patients in under 20 minutes without causing a panic. That takes skill. Sarah picked up the morning chart. Get some coffee. The day shift is in 2 hours and you need to hand over clearly. Deb stared at her. You are the calmest person I have ever met in my entire life. That's not always a compliment, Sarah said and started her rounds. She stopped at bed 5. Marcus Hayes was awake. She'd have been surprised if he wasn't sitting up with his arms crossed and his leg elevated on a pillow he'd arranged himself during the chaos. He looked at her when she came to his bedside, and what was on his face was not the contained curiosity of the past 2 weeks. It was open. Whatever wall he'd been keeping up had come down sometime around 3 in the morning, and he hadn't put it back. She reached for his chart. I need to check your leg. My leg is the least interesting thing happening right now. Your leg is the thing I'm responsible for. She moved to the foot of the bed and began unwrapping the dressing with careful, practiced hands. The wound had bled slightly. She'd expected that given what he'd put it through. She examined it without rushing. You reopened the lower margin. Not badly, but you need imaging in the morning to confirm you haven't stressed the repair. Okay, he said. She looked up. He almost never just said okay. What? She said. I'm trying to decide how to ask you something without it coming out wrong. He watched her hands. You were in Team 9. She didn't answer immediately. She cleaned the wound margin, applied a fresh dressing, worked with the same steady hands that had done this on days when the work was the only thing keeping her from the space inside her own head. "Yeah," she said, "you lost your team." "Yes. And then you became a nurse." She taped the last edge of the dressing down. "I was always both things, Marcus. The Navy trained me as a medic before they trained me for anything else. After Kandahar, I needed to do the part that saved people." She straightened up. The other part had stopped feeling like something I could hold. He was quiet for a long moment. "And tonight," she looked at him. "Tonight I held both of them." She picked up his chart. "How does the leg feel?" "Like I walked on it at 3 in the morning." He met her eyes. "Worth it." And she wrote in his chart. He watched her write, and the ward was quiet around them. The particular quiet of the hour before dawn, when the night shift is winding down and the day hasn't started, and the world exists in a kind of suspended stillness. In that stillness, Marcus Hayes did something he almost never did. He said what he was actually thinking. "You scared the hell out of me," he said, "when you walked into that corridor. Watching you go in there with those two operatives, knowing where you were and what you were walking into." He stopped. "I wasn't scared," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "That's what scared me." She was quiet for a moment. "When you've done it enough times," she said, "the fear moves somewhere. It doesn't go away. It just relocates. It becomes part of the preparation instead of a reaction to it." She set down his chart. "You know that. You've been downrange 3 times, and I know it for myself," he said. "Watching it happen to someone else is a different thing." She looked at him, really looked at him in the way she'd let herself look at him exactly once before for 2 seconds in the corridor the previous night. She let it run a beat longer this time. "Get some sleep, Sergeant," she said. "You have imaging at 0800, and I'm going to have to explain to Dr. Thompson why you're presenting with a reopened wound dressing." "What are you going to tell him?" "That you were ambulatory during the night under circumstances I'm documenting separately." She picked up the chart. "He'll understand." She moved to the next bed. At 6:15, General Hawkins arrived. She hadn't expected the general she'd expected base command in some form, but the full presence of Major General Thomas Hawkins, who commanded the regional operation and whose name was on the hospital's authorization documents, and whose appearance at a field hospital at 6 in the morning meant that the night's events had moved up the chain considerably faster than she'd calculated. He came in through the main entrance with 2 aides and went directly to Diana Reeves, who had set up a temporary command position in the consultation room at the north end of the ward. Sarah watched this from the nurse's station, writing up her overnight notes with the steady hand of someone who processes by doing. She was on her 4th page when the aide appeared at her elbow. "Nurse Bennett, the general would like to speak with you." She finished the sentence she was writing. Then she capped her pen and went. Hawkins was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of face that had been serious so long it had set that way. He stood at the head of the consultation table with Reeves to his left and a man from the Judge Advocate General's office to his right, and he watched Sarah come in with the particular attention of someone who has already been briefed and is now comparing the briefing to the reality. "Nurse Bennett," he said, "General." "Sit down." She sat. He looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look. She had nothing to hide that she hadn't already chosen to keep private, and those were 2 very different things. "I've been given a summary of last night's events," he said. "I've also been given your personnel file. Both of them." "Then you know more than most people," she said. "I know that this hospital's security situation was compromised, going back to the logistics coordination of Colonel Whitfield's transfer. I know that the compromise was not caught by base security or by the detail assigned to the colonel. I know that it was caught by a staff nurse on night shift who subsequently secured 2 operatives, coordinated the protection of a high-value witness, and preserved critical evidence." He paused. "What I'd like to know is how you identified the threat when a full security detail didn't." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Ferris and his instant deflection. She thought about 6 escorts for a medical transfer and the formation patterns that didn't quite match standard protective service, and the compass needle in her chest that had been pointing at something wrong since the moment the convoy pulled in. "I've been trained to read threat environments," she said, "and I read this one." "For how long?" I identified the anomaly when the colonel arrived. I had a reasonable threat assessment by the following morning. I acted when I confirmed the IV line had been compromised. Hawkins leaned forward. Why didn't you report the anomaly when you first identified it? It was the question she'd been ready for. It was also the question that was hardest to answer honestly. Because I didn't have enough to report, she said. I had a pattern read and an instinct. Neither of those is reportable through standard channels. She held his gaze. And because the penetration of the security detail meant I didn't know which channels were clean. The JAG officer made a note. Hawkins studied her. You operated independently because you didn't trust the chain. I operated carefully, she said, because I've seen what happens when a compromised chain is notified too early. In Team 9. In general, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Colonel Whitfield is alive because of what you did last night. The evidence you preserved is going to close a case that has been running for 2 years and has cost his command considerably in assets and resources. He let that settle. I want to know what you need. She blinked, just slightly. It was not the question she'd been bracing for. What I need from this command, from this hospital, from any resource available to me. He kept his voice level and genuine, the voice of a man who has decided to mean exactly what he says. Name it. She looked at him. She thought about it, actually thought about it, the way she hadn't let herself think about what she wanted in 22 months. She thought about Torres and his ceiling and his 20 seconds. She thought about Deb and Price and the team she'd built without intending to in 11 weeks of keeping her head down. She thought about Thompson and his 3 incident reports in his pajama pants and his genuine grudging apology in a room at 4:30 in the morning. My patients, she said. I need to finish my shift and take care of my patients. Hawkins looked at her for a long moment. Then for the first time since he'd walked in, something in his face shifted. Not much, just enough. Is that all for now, she said. He nodded slowly. The debriefing is at 0900. After that, I want you to think about what else I can offer you, Lieutenant. Because what you did last night is not something I'm willing to file and forget. She stood. I'll think about it, General. She walked out of the consultation room and back into the ward where the morning shift was beginning to arrive and the monitors were beeping their steady rhythms. And Private First Class Elijah Torres was awake in bed 12 staring at the ceiling. But this time, when she came to stand at the foot of his bed, he looked at her differently than he had at midnight. I heard some things, he said carefully, from the night, noises. The hospital had a security situation, she said. It's been handled. He looked at her for a moment. Are you okay? She considered the question. It was the first time in 11 weeks that anyone in this building had asked her that, and it landed in a place she hadn't expected. Yeah, she said, I am. Were you, he stopped, tried again. Were you the one who handled it? She checked his chart. His vitals were good. His concussion assessment was clear. He'd eaten something, according to the overnight note. You should eat breakfast, she said. The morning rotation will bring trays at 0700. Torres looked at her for a long moment. It was you, come in, he said quietly. Not a question anymore. She set his chart back in its holder. Outside the ward windows, the Afghan sky was doing what it did every morning, going from black to the particular deep blue that preceded dawn, a color that was almost gentle if you caught it in the right moment. Get some breakfast, Torres, she said. You've got a long road back, and you need to eat for it. She moved to the next bed, and the ward moved around her day shift, arriving equipment, checked charts, exchanged the ordinary machinery of a hospital, coming online for another day. And Sarah Bennett moved through the middle of all of it, neither hidden nor announced, neither the rookie the badge described, nor the weapon the night had revealed, but something that contained both things fully and completely and did not need anyone else to reconcile them. She was a nurse. She was a soldier. She was the woman who had walked into a dark corridor at 2:47 in the morning with nothing but training and certainty and had come back out the other side. She was both things. She had always been both things. And the morning was just beginning. The debrief lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Sarah sat across from Diana Reeves and the JAG officer, and 2 men she'd never been introduced to by name, only by function, one from Signals Intelligence, one from the Inspector General's office, and she gave them everything. Every detail in sequence with the precision of someone who had been trained to reconstruct events under pressure and whose memory did not soften things by accident. She told them about Ferris and the deflection pattern. She told them about the transmitter device and what Garrett had said in the corridor. She told them about the IV line discoloration and what it indicated. She gave them the contractor's name and the specific detail the colonel had provided about the logistics coordination, and she watched the JAG officer's pen move faster when she said it, which told her that name was already in a file somewhere, and her confirmation had just added weight to something that was already significant. When she was done, Reeves set down her pen and looked at her across the table. "You said you identified the threat pattern within hours of the colonel's arrival," she said. "But you waited before acting." "Yes." "Why, babe?" Sarah had thought about this during her shift in the spaces between patients and charts and the ordinary work of the ward. She'd thought about what the true answer was, stripped of the operational framing, stripped of the instinct versus evidence calculation she could have defaulted to. "Because I wasn't sure I was right," she said, "and in a building full of sick people, being wrong is its own kind of damage." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. "But you acted when you needed to." "When I had confirmation, yes." "You could have called it in earlier, before you had confirmation." "And if I'd been wrong about Ferris, I would have blown the cover of a legitimate security detail on the basis of a feeling." She held Reeves's gaze. "I've seen operations fail because someone called too early, and I've seen people die because someone called too late. I made a judgment." She paused. "I still believe it was the right one." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the man from Signals Intelligence, who had not spoken once in 3 hours, said without looking up from his notes, "It was." Reeves closed her folder. "That's all we need for now. We may have follow-up questions as the prosecution builds." "I'll be here," Sarah said. She stood. "Is there anything else?" "One thing." Reeves looked at her directly, and for the second time since 4 in the morning, the professional face shifted slightly just at the edges into something real. "How are you doing after last night?" It was the second time in 12 hours someone had asked her that. She thought about what she'd told Torres. She thought about what it felt like to stand in a dark corridor at 2:47 with 2 operatives and nothing but training, and the 31 people she was responsible for. She thought about Kandahar and 6 people and a door that closed 22 months ago, and that she had for exactly one night walked back through. "I'm okay," she said, and this time she meant it in a way she hadn't been sure of when she'd said it to Torres. "I'm genuinely okay." Reeves nodded. "Good." Sarah walked out. The ward in the late morning had the particular energy of a place that had metabolized a crisis and returned to its rhythm. The overnight drama had filtered through the staff in the way things filter through small communities in pieces, in whispers, in the charged silences, between people who knew something had happened and weren't sure how much of it they were allowed to acknowledge. The day shift nurses moved through their routines with a slightly heightened awareness. The soldiers in the beds were quieter than usual, which meant they were paying more attention. Thompson was at the nurse's station when she came back to the ward. He had changed clothes, no more pajama pants, and he looked like a man who had slept for exactly 90 minutes and decided that was enough. He looked up when she came in, and what was on his face was still the open revised version she'd seen in the imaging suite at 4:30. It hadn't closed back up the way she'd half expected it to in the daylight. "How was the debrief?" he said. "Complete." She reached for her chart. "How's the colonel?" "Fever broke at 0800. He's eating, demanding updates." Thompson paused. "He asked me about you." She looked up. "What did he ask?" "He wanted to know if you were staying on deployment or if you'd be pulled for operational reasons." Thompson folded his arms. "I told him I didn't know. Then he told me that if I had any say in the matter, I should fight to keep you, and I told him that the thought had already occurred to me." He held her gaze. "I'm withdrawing the incident reports." "Thompson?" "All 3 of them." He was firm. "They were wrong. I was wrong. I knew you were good within the first week, and I kept writing you up because you made me feel like I was losing control of my own trauma bay, and that is not a medical reason to file against a staff member." He exhaled. "I'm telling you directly because you deserve to hear it from me directly and not through HR." She looked at him. In the daylight without the crisis around them, Raymond Thompson was something she hadn't had the space to see clearly, before a man who was genuinely skilled at his work, genuinely committed to his patients, and genuinely difficult to be around. All three things at once, no contradiction. She recognized the combination because she'd spent years looking in mirrors. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." He nodded, tight, genuine. "Don't make it weird." She almost smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." She went to check on Garrett. He was being held in the base security office pending formal processing, but Reeves had told her he was cooperating fully and that his claim of attempting to transmit an abort signal had been partially corroborated by the signal logs recovered from the transmitter device. It didn't absolve him, but it was a distinction that mattered. She'd asked Reeves to note in her statement that Garrett had given her information voluntarily and had actively cooperated in the corridor. She didn't know if it would help him. She gave the information anyway because accuracy mattered more than outcome. She stopped at bed 12 on her way back through the ward. Torres was sitting up eating something from a tray with the careful attention of someone who has rediscovered that food is actually something they want. He looked better. Not good. Good would take months, and the 20 seconds were still going to play for a long time, but better in the specific way that means a person has taken one small step back from the edge of something. He looked up when she came to his bedside. "I heard more things," he said carefully. "You're recovering well," she said, checking his vitals on the monitor. "Concussion is clearing. We'll do a final assessment this afternoon, and if it's just clean, you may be looking at mobility clearance in the next few days." "Nurse Bennett," he said her name the way Marcus had said it, like nailing it down, like making sure she heard it as a specific thing. "I know it was you in the corridor last night. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know what kind of sounds those were, and I know they weren't a heating problem." He paused. "I just want to say thank you." She looked at him. "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to." He met her eyes. "I want to. There's a difference." She thought about telling him that the debt moved the other direction, that patients like him, 22-year-olds who survived IED blasts and lay awake at midnight replaying things they couldn't change, were the reason she'd picked up a nursing badge in the first place. That the work in this building, in these beds, was not a lesser version of what she'd done before. It was the same work, just without the rifle. The protecting was identical. Only the tools were different. She didn't say all of that. She said, "You're going to be okay, Torres." That's not a comfort phrase. That's a clinical assessment. She set down his chart. "Eat the rest of that." He picked up his fork. She was back at the nurse's station when the shift changed again, and Deb came in for her afternoon rotation, looking like someone who had slept for 5 hours and thought deeply about everything she'd seen in the past 12. She stopped at the station and looked at Sarah and said, "I need you to know something." "Okay," Sarah said. "When you told me to move the patients last night, and I didn't know why I was terrified, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't." She stood very straight, the way people stand when they're saying something that costs them. "But I did it because I trusted you, and I want you to know that the trusting was not blind. It was, I've been watching you for 11 weeks, same as everyone else, and I knew. I didn't know what I knew, but I knew you were someone worth trusting." Sarah looked at her for a moment. "That means a lot to me, Deb. I also want to learn how to do what you do, the clinical stuff, the chest tube, the airway management, She stopped. "I mean the nursing parts. I know there are other parts that I'm not, I just mean the nursing." "I know what you mean." Sarah handed her the afternoon chart. "Talk to Thompson about an advanced clinical rotation. Tell him I recommended you." She paused. "He'll make a face, but he'll do it." Deb looked at the chart, then back at her. "Really? You moved 15 patients in 20 minutes without causing a panic," Sarah said. "That's not beginner work. That's someone who knows how to manage people under pressure." She held Deb's gaze. "You just haven't been given the clinical vocabulary to go with it yet. That's fixable." Deb stood a little straighter. "Okay," she said. "Okay, yeah." She took the chart and went. The afternoon was deep into its second half when Marcus Hayes appeared at the nurse's station. He was on crutches. The imaging at 0800 had confirmed what Sarah had suspected, a minor stress complication to the wound repair that took him off his feet for weight bearing, but not off his feet entirely, and he moved down the ward with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that crutches are a logistical problem and not a limitation. He stopped at the station. General Hawkins is back, he said. He wants to see you, the consultation room. She looked up. How do you know that? Because he stopped at my bed first and asked me to come get you, which I told him I was happy to do. He paused. He also asked me what I knew about your background, and I told him I knew exactly what I'd been able to figure out on my own, and he said that was more than most people, which I took as a compliment. She set down her pen. You're supposed to be resting. I'm on crutches. Crutches are restful. He looked at her, and the open, unguarded quality from the previous night was still there, settled now, less raw but real. He's going to offer you something, Marcus said. From the way he talked this morning, it's not a small something. She looked at him. I'm not telling you what to do, he said quickly. I've been here 2 weeks, and I leave when this leg clears, so I don't have a vote in any of this. I know that. He shifted his weight on the crutches. I just think you should know that whatever he offers you, you've earned it. Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to decide it. She studied him for a moment. 12 years of combat deployments had given Marcus Hayes the ability to say exactly what he meant without decorating it, and she appreciated that more than she could comfortably express. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Go, I'll cover the station. You're a patient. I can read a monitor. He settled himself against the station counter. Go. General Hawkins was standing when she entered the consultation room, which told her this conversation was going to be different from the one at 6 in the morning. He gestured to the chairs. They both sat. I spoke with Diana Reeves after the debrief, he said, and with Colonel Whitfield, and with the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, who is now aware that one of their former Team 9 operators has been serving as a staff nurse in my field hospital for the past 11 weeks. He looked at her steadily. Commander Whitfield, who will be out of that bed and back in uniform in approximately 2 weeks according to Thompson, would like to recommend you for a formal commendation. The JAG office is adding your witness statement to the prosecution file. The Signals Intelligence team has used the transmitter data you recovered to identify 2 additional members of the contractor's network who were not previously flagged. He paused. One of them is inside command intelligence. We wouldn't have found him without the transmitter. She absorbed this. The weight of it, the additional reach, the penetration that went further than even Reeves had assessed, settled in her chest with a particular gravity of information that changes the scale of something you thought you understood. Inside command intelligence, she said. Yes, his access has been suspended. The investigation is ongoing. Hawkins leaned forward slightly. What happened last night was not simply a hospital security incident, Lieutenant. It was the breach that broke the network. The contractor is in custody as of 0600 this morning. His financial accounts are frozen. The prosecution file is complete. He held her gaze. You did that. Not entirely alone, you had Hayes Thompson, the colonel himself. But the architecture of it was yours. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that didn't sound like either false modesty or the wrong kind of pride. She let it sit. I made you an offer this morning, Hawkins said. I told you to tell me what you need. You said your patience. He studied her. That answer is still true. It's still true, she said, but it's not the complete answer. He waited. She had spent the afternoon between patients turning over what she wanted, what the night had clarified and what it had complicated. She had spent 22 months building the nurse, pouring everything into it that had nowhere else to go after Kandahar, after the door closed on 6 people and opened for only 1. She had genuinely believed, that the other thing, the operator, the weapons, the dark corridors, was something she had finished with. Set down, decided she couldn't carry anymore. And then 2:47 in the morning had arrived, and she'd picked it up without thinking, and it had felt like her own hands. I want to stay here, she said, at this hospital, in this role. She met his gaze. But I want to be formally recognized as what I am. Both things, not just the badge and not just the file. I want the medical staff to know what my background is, and I want the command structure to know that I'm available if a situation requires what I can do. She paused. I'm not asking to be pulled into operations. I'm asking to stop pretending that half of what I bring to this building doesn't exist. Hawkins looked at her. You want to be out in the open. I want to stop keeping the door closed, she said. It didn't help anyone, including me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The classified administrative separation from Team 9 that was your request." "Yes. You walked away from a career that most people spend their lives trying to reach." "I walked away from something I couldn't hold anymore." She kept her voice steady. "I found something I could." "I'm not walking away from that either. I'm asking to hold both." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm worth to this hospital, General. I'm not going to be modest about it. I also know what I'm worth beyond it. I'm not going to be modest about that either. I'm asking to be used fully." The room was quiet. Then Hawkins said, "Done." One word, flat and complete. She blinked. "I'll have the personnel adjustment process through command by end of week. Your file here will be amended to reflect your full background and qualifications. You'll hold your current nursing role, and you'll be formally designated as a clinical tactical advisor, a role I'm going to have the JAG office create specifically because it doesn't currently exist, and it should." He stood. "You'll also receive a formal commendation for last night entered into both your medical and your military record." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" She stood and shook his hand. His grip was firm and meant something. "Yes, General, we do." He nodded. "Then get back to your patients, Lieutenant." She walked out of the consultation room and into the ward, and the ward was exactly as she'd left it. Monitors and charts and beds and the ordinary sound of people being kept alive by people who had decided that was the work they were going to do. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not just the night's events, not just the commendation or the conversation with Hawkins or the file that was going to be amended, but the whole thing 11 weeks. The closed door, the distance she'd kept the two lives she'd been carrying separately as though they couldn't occupy the same body. They could. They had. They had in fact proven it in a fairly definitive way at 2:47 in the morning. Deb waved at her from the east end of the ward, a small, quick gesture that meant a patient needed something routine. Sarah waved back and walked toward it. She passed Torres, who gave her a small nod over his lunch tray. She passed Price, who looked at her with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had seen more than he'd been told and had chosen the specific wisdom of not making a production of it. She passed bed after bed of men and women who had come into this building, broken and were being put back together by people who did that work because it was the most honest work they knew. She stopped at bed 5. Marcus Hayes had returned from his unauthorized stint at the nurses' station and was back in his bed with his leg elevated and his arms folded and his face doing something that looked like it was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing. He watched her come to his bedside and waited. "How'd it go?" he said. "Well," she picked up his chart. "I'm staying." Something in his face moved. He kept it controlled. He was good at controlled, but she caught it. Staying as in this hospital, this role, this ward. She made a note in the chart, with some adjustments to how I'm officially described. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's good." She looked at him. "Your leg is healing well. At the current rate, you're looking at clearance to return to limited duty in 3 weeks. Full duty in 6. 6 weeks, he said, give or take. He looked at her, and what was in his face was the specific expression of a man who is calculating something that has nothing to do with a timeline and everything to do with a person standing at the foot of his bed with a chart in her hands and a decision already made behind her eyes. "So you'll still be here," he said, "in 6 weeks." "I'll still be here," she said. He let out a slow breath. "Okay." He settled back against his pillow. "Then I'm okay with 6 weeks." She set his chart down. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment in the afternoon light, in the middle of the ward that had been her whole world for 11 weeks and was going to keep being her world. And she felt something she had kept very carefully out of reach for 22 months settle back into place. Not peace exactly. She'd stopped expecting peace the way other people seemed to experience it, clean and complete. What she felt was something more specific and more real. The feeling of a person standing fully in their own life, not in a version of it that was safe to carry, but in the whole actual weight of it. Both things, all of it. No door closed. Deb called her name from across the ward. Torres was asking about his discharge timeline. Price had a question about the afternoon medication schedule. Thompson needed a consult on the chest case in Bay 2. The ward was alive and demanding and full of people who needed exactly what she had come here to give. Sarah Bennett picked up her chart and went to work. She was a nurse who had walked into the dark and come back out. She was an operator who had learned that saving a life with steady hands in a lit room was not a lesser thing than saving one in the dark. She was the woman who had spent 11 weeks being underestimated and one night proving in the most definitive terms available that underestimating her had been the most expensive mistake anyone in that building had ever made. She was both things fully without apology, without hiding, without the closed door. And in the ward where the monitors beeped and the soldiers healed and the work went on, the real necessary honest work of keeping people alive, Sarah Bennett was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was built to do. And nothing in the world was ever going to make her invisible again.